So it's truly a privilege and an honor for me to introduce Drew Shirk and David Schumacher to you. I'm really pleased that we are able to start out with them today in order to get a good launch, if you will, here towards the end of the third week of session. I know these guys are relatively well-known faces to all of you, but I'll just give you a bit of their bio. Drew is the Executive Director of Legislative Affairs for the Governor. He is at the 22-year mark of service in state government. He began his work over at the Department of Revenue, working from tax discovery, which usually happens for me after I go to the mailbox. But we've known him more for his work in the legislative area, even there. So it's no surprise that Drew received the Governor's Leadership and Management Award, which is about working hard and working well in a performance-driven culture, and we've all seen evidence of that over the time. So please help me welcome Drew, but don't jump yet, Drew, because we're going to introduce David. So. I'd also like to introduce David Schumacher, who is an old friend. He even spent a short time on the dark side with us. But he has 20 years of experience in budgeting and policy development work in state government. He started out at the Department of Revenue as an economic analyst there, and then over to OFM. We all remember the SHU years as the budget analyst for the Senate Ways and Means Committee as well. Please help me welcome David. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Drew, and then we will go to David and then have questions shortly thereafter.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate being here. I think it's been a couple of years since I've seen you all, and some new faces and some old faces. Really happy to be here. I think I have to update my bio. I think I'm at like 29 years now of state service. Yeah, so whatever I've got online is probably a little old, but I've been around a while, and I've been with the governor now 2 years as his legislative director. After all the years, I think I had 27 years total at Department of Revenue. So thank you very much. I enjoy coming and speaking with you, and I know we've had a lot of collaborative things over the years, and sometimes we agree and sometimes we don't agree, but at least we've been able to work through those, and so I've always appreciated AWB's willingness to engage and work with us. As you're well aware, we have a big legislative agenda with the governor, probably the biggest that we've had while he's been in office. Some people are, questioning, well, why so much now? And they've got lots of theories around that. I think one of the things you also should realize is this is the last biennium of the second term. So regardless of other things that people might be thinking, we are also, we have a clock as well. And so if we're going to get things done, we need to get moving. And so that was what drove our formation of our legislative agenda. The good part is I will let Shu talk about the budget side, so the part that you're really concerned about, he can answer those questions. I'll talk about the good stuff. I've told Schumacher that since I've come from revenue, at revenue we said no a lot, as you're probably well aware. In this job, I actually get to say yes a lot and see how we can try to solve problems. And so David gets to chase me around, reeling me back in from being too agreeable. So this year's agenda is a lot of that. So as you well know, we've got 5 really big categories of things that we're working on. And I'll start first with our early learning package. This is something that the governor has felt is very important, that we need to fully fund ECAP, get the 4-year-olds taken care of, but also we want to engage in a new process of trying to work on the birth to 3 phase. Brain science is showing that that is one of the most productive things that we can do to invest in early childhood development to have successful start. And every dollar that we put in up front will hopefully reduce our costs later on, either in education, in our public assistance, in our criminal justice, in our mental health. So getting early involvement and getting opportunities created early is a high priority for the governor, and that's the focus of our early learning package. And we have 2 bills that do that, the ECAP and then home visit. Our higher ed agenda, this is something that I assume a lot of your folks are supportive of, is a bigger investment in higher ed. And we have 2 pieces of that. One of them is our career-connected learning, which is developing the tech side of things and moving forward with, why is the term slipping my mind, Shu? They're called apprenticeships. Apprenticeships, and making that a substantive part of our education system so that we can tailor learning to what are the needs of business and industry so that we actually have a workforce that's educated in a way and in the subject areas that you need to be successful. And we need to tie that to our higher education system. And how do we build that experience and credit that you can earn while doing apprenticeships and the technical side, as well as those who might want to transition into higher ed, and how do we bring that together? So that's a big part of the focus of our career-connected learning, and I know you've been involved working with MAUD as we develop that. The other part of it is also a big investment in transforming our state need grant and fully funding the state need grant and transforming it into the Washington College Promise, which would make that as a commitment that we would tie into the future budgets, but also provide assistance to higher ed in helping with their budgets and our opportunity to grow enrollments in Washington and create additional access for Washington's students to get a 4-year degree. So that has been a big portion of our focus for our Washington College Promise and our budget funding. Another area, this doesn't come as a surprise to you, one of the governor's highest priorities is climate and environment. We, as you know, in the past have proposed either a cap and trade or a carbon tax. We all are aware of the results of the referendum that we had, the initiative that we had this year. And as a result of that, we stepped back and took a look at what are other ways that we can try to achieve our climate goals and move us forward in reducing our impact to global warming. What we've done with that is that we've broken it into a couple of smaller bills. One of those, is you're probably aware of, is the 100% clean, which would move us to clean energy goal by 2045 with targets that would be established along the way. And helping our utilities transform our use of petroleum products and transfer to more clean technology and clean energy. That's one of our big bills. Another bill that we're proposing is taking action on clean buildings and investing in clean building development, whether it's new construction and over time retrofitting of larger facilities. I know we've had a lot of conversations with folks about those impacts, but building greenhouse gas emissions is one of those areas that we can move the needle, and so we are starting that conversation. The other bill that we have proposed is our clean transportation, which is our EV, electric vehicle tax incentives, our zero emission vehicle incentives, and also our infrastructure for charging and other things to help move us towards a cleaner vehicle solution. In healthcare, we have a couple of bills. One of them is on opioids and trying to address the opioid scourge and accessibility to opioids, and working with our boards and commissions to make sure that we are aligned with the medical industry on making sure that prescriptions are handled properly, and also working on treatment and prevention. And then another program that we are working on with Senator Frocht and Cody is developing the foundation for a public option alternative for healthcare access. The last two bills, one of them is something that has been a priority for our rural Washington, is our broadband and developing access to rural broadband, working with industry and government to develop strategies and come up with funding to be able to identify hard-to-serve areas, areas that are in serious need of access to broadband so that they can have access to higher ed, healthcare, economic development, and building prosperity for all of Washington. And it's one of the things that we've heard from our rural communities. It's something that they're in need of. And then the last item that we have proposed is prepaid postage for all ballots. And so we have a proposal to do that and worked with the Secretary of State. So as you can see, that totals about 19 different bills, 38 total between the House and the Senate. So it's a huge agenda. And now Shu can tell you how we're going to pay for it all.
Thank you, Drew.
That's how it usually works, right? You start with the dessert and then give the microphone to the OFM director. So thanks for the invitation. I think for some of you, you probably heard some of this before or you'll hear it again. I know we have overlapping groups. I figure by the 8th time, Gary will believe me. This is the 3rd time, so I don't expect it today. But we do appreciate the invitation. Obviously, Drew ran through a lot of the high-profile ads that are in our budget. I think it's probably helpful. You know, we have a highlight document that's online that you could go through and look section by section if you're interested in one or another. I thought I would use my time here to talk less about how much each of those things cost and more to give people a sense of why we are where we are in the budget and kind of address some of the questions that I hear walking around in the parking lot or the sundial. You know, questions like, how in the world is $50 billion not enough to run a state? Which sounds like a good question. I saw somebody text the other day, how in the world is $5 billion not enough to run a state? Which I assume is a typo, but to me it makes about as much sense, right? Whoever was writing that had no idea if is $5 billion a lot, is $50 billion a lot, is $500 billion a lot, right? Obviously $50 billion is a lot. The point that I've made as I've talked about our budget is, you know, the rhetoric of, oh, isn't $50 billion too much is all well and good. What would you not do if you were going to have a $50 billion budget? We could have balanced the budget at 50. We could have balanced the budget at 40, right? We chose not to. And one of the biggest drivers of that is the K-12 commitments that were made last biennium, the McCleary commitments. The bills were passed, but they were not fully funded until this biennium. So rather than a typical year, I mean, K-12 is big, it grows, it costs a lot of money, we all know that. A typical year, the growth in the maintenance level of K-12 would be about $1.5 billion. Just regular growth. Things are a little more expensive, there's a few more kids, you know, times millions, and it's real money. This year it was over $4 billion, right? So we've got $2.5 billion extra dollars attributed to the decisions that were made and bragged about in the last couple of years around McCleary. Without that $2.5 billion, right, the whole outlook would be different. So when you look at the $50 billion, okay, what does $50 billion get you? $50 billion gets you almost to pay for the government that we have, and would be short, let's say, $700 million. So without buying a single new thing, paying for everything that we're currently committed to, we're about $700 million underwater as a starting point. And again, the big reason for that is K-12. If it weren't for K-12, we'd be telling you that we have, you know, plenty of money to do these things without raising revenue. So we're $700 million underwater, and then what are the next steps? And I'm going to keep talking. This is at the beginning of our highlights, if anybody wants to look at our highlights. And it kind of lays out in order how we built the budget and where we stopped. So first, maintenance level, and then the questions about what kind of things do we want to cut out of the budget. I will admit to you that there are very few cuts in this budget. Right? We are still trying to dig out for our state agencies things that were cut during the recession. Right? You know, the biggest, easiest example to point to is, you know, what we did to our mental health system in those years and how we've been digging to get out of it ever since. So this was not a cut-based budget. So starting from the modest hole that we had, what did we pay for? We've got 3% per year salary increases for state employees. Okay, that's 3% are not huge increases. For everybody, that's several $100 million. The next one is SEB. So some of you have heard this before and probably didn't care the first time you heard it, so I apologize here the second time you heard it. But the legislature last year passed a bill that's been banging around here for almost a decade that would give the teachers to set up a parallel structure for teachers' health care to the one that state employees have. And the legislature passed a bill to direct us to do that and direct the state rather than the individual school districts to do the negotiations. So I think there was some thought that having the state do it would put some efficiencies into the process. The problem or the benefit, depending on how you want to look at it, is that on top of those efficiencies, the bill also directed us, it gave us certain parameters with which to negotiate. And those parameters were really expensive, right? One of them was to provide health care to the part-time employees at the school districts. Currently, state employees who meet a certain hourly threshold get covered. People in school districts did not. So that was a multi-$100 million add to the cost, because we're covering people that weren't covered before, right? This is not a matter of things getting more expensive. This is almost solely a version of covering people that didn't used to be covered. The other thing that was done was currently there's a certain level of dollars per covered life that go out for PEB and for SEB. PEB is the public, SEB is the schools. School teachers and employees have fallen way behind public employees in recent years. And the bill, the legislative bill, directing us to bring those into parity. So that was also several $100 million of new costs, right? We're driving more dollars into this system than before. And you'll ask, well, where does that money go, right? They had perfectly good health care before. Where did all this money go? Well, to be honest, they had pretty lousy health care before, right? I would say through the years, teachers have often negotiated for better salaries and lousier health care. That's been their trade-off. So teachers with families have much worse or much more expensive health care than state employees with families. And covering those families, so a family with 3 kids versus a single teacher had wildly different benefit structures. Aligning those drove a lot of costs. So how much in cost? You'll hear people talk about SEB being $900 million. I would say that it's really like $600 million because we were going to have to pay the costs of teachers' health care increases anyway, right? That was going to be part of the, right? We were going to have teachers' health care costs were going to go up. So the increment from SEB is could think of as about $600 million. So right now, all we've done is paid for everything that we had before. We gave people raises, and we did the SEB bill that the legislature told us to do. Okay, so we're like $2.5 billion underwater right now. And this is really kind of how the structure of the budget goes. And we had the meeting with the governor as these numbers are beginning to solidify in the fall. And he's like, well, what about all the stuff that Drew talked about? That's what I want to do, right? I don't want, just like the legislature is facing right now, they don't want to talk about how much does the plumbing cost. They want to talk about early learning and higher ed and opioids and mental health. All of that stuff is coming on a base of this, $2.5 billion hole that we've been left with. So the decision that we made, and the legislature can make their own decision, is if we're going to raise revenue this much, how much further will we go on what we called this summer the governor's strategic initiatives? And we had various parts of his policy team and budget team thinking about what kind of higher ed system does he want to leave when he's done with this term? What kind of early learning? What things are undone? And what things are people talking about, right? He's not the only one that has ever thought that we should fully fund the state need grant. The state need grant is the most popular with teachers, with students, administrations, parents. The only thing, he says, that's holding us back is there's never quite enough money to fully fund it. So you end up with thousands of students every year that qualify, and by the time they make it to their financial aid office, they're told that, yeah, you qualify, but the money's gone. Right? We tried to put an end to that. Everybody wants to fully fund ECAP and ramp it up and make it an entitlement. Right? These are things that are wildly popular and are the last things that typically fall off budgets. And to be honest, some of these things are, if the legislature doesn't manage to raise the revenue that we proposed, are the things that are at risk. Right? I don't think the $4 billion of K-12 and maintenance level is at risk. Right? That is now constitutionally protected. But that $4 billion that we have to absorb in the budget is putting tremendous pressure on everything that is not constitutionally protected in the budget. If you want to think about it, the legislature, as they often do, and I used to help them do it, never solves any more of the problem than they absolutely have to, and usually solves somewhat less of the problem that they ought to. And we're in a position here where they knew that we were launching into this new McCleary world and putting this huge obligation onto us, and added just enough revenue to, if you cross your fingers and you squinted, maybe it would be enough, knowing pretty well that it probably wouldn't be enough. And now we're here, and everybody's surprised that what everything cost when this was exactly the conversation at the time. So none of this is a surprise. None of these costs were not forecast. We knew that we were coming here, and now here we are, and we're wrestling with this. One other thing that I think people should, or another one of my parking lot questions is, we just did McCleary, why are you guys blowing the whole thing up the very first year? And to which I would argue, well, one, it's 2 years. But really, we're not blowing up 95% of it, right? We put a whole structure in place. We put a whole new formulas in place, put some of the required revenue in place. But the question about local levies is something that we believe is obviously broken and needs to be addressed. That for a lot of school districts, the added money on the state side and the reduction in money on the local side is going to put them in a place where effectively they have less money than they had before, whether that's less in total terms or less flexible money. I've heard some places where maybe they have more money in one pot, but they don't have any flexibility to use it somewhere else. So you're going to hear school districts talking about layoffs. And the public thinks that we gave them buckets of money. And in a sense, for a lot of them, we didn't. We changed the structure of where their money comes from. We believe, the governor believes, that school districts need the ability to prove to their local voters, if they need more money, to provide the extras, whether it's extra teachers, whether it's Saturday classes, whatever those extras might be, can be decided school district by school district. That capacity was reined in too far, and we wanted to loosen it back up and let school districts figure that out. Because I think the alternative is we are going to have layoffs and I don't want to call it strikes or, different schools are going to react to this differently. And I think we have an opportunity here to get in front of it and solve it in a way that each of the 280 whatever school districts can solve it on their own. Some school districts are going to want to solve this by saying, this is fine. We got a lot of extra money from the state. We have plenty of money, and our property taxes went down a lot. We're good, which is a perfectly fine solution. Some districts are going to say, wait a minute, we have all of these little programs that our folks love. We can still cut our local rates half as much as we used to have, but we need some of that capacity to invest. And there's 285 of these decisions that are going to be made. The governor's position is that they should have the local ability to sort that out for themselves. So those are two of the big things that I think people, everybody's interested in some little thing or little bills or specific things. Those are kind of two overarching things that I thought it might be helpful, at least to know where we're coming from on those.
Thank you, David.